All right, here we go. Another video lesson. First and foremost, I updated my Mac and look at this beautiful background. Like that is really look at the mountains and how the colors change, and I think that's snow up top. It's like clouds and snow up there, and that's just really neat. I did not expect a new background. I like nature pictures. Um, so anyways, that is completely unrelated to today's topic, but I wanted to share that beautiful picture. So we are going to be doing this lesson on the subject of eschatology, and you can thank Jenna for that one. This is all her fault. She's the one that commented in the video, hey, you should do a video on eschatology. And great, okay. There's a slight downside to this, though, and that is that eschatology is a subject that I know not a lot about, where the issues surrounding God's sovereignty and Calvinism, Arminianism, open theism, those kind of subjects. I've researched that a lot. It's an interesting field to me. I'm one of those people that has never really cared about the study of the end times. I've always just sort of had this philosophy that, yes, Jesus is coming back someday. I am called to live my life as a good Christian now, and that's that. And so I never spent much time thinking about the end times. It was never something that I felt the need to really focus on. But it's a subject that a lot of people find interesting. And as I said in my video on the subject of God's sovereignty, predestination, and on those sort of things, whereas the argument around predestination, sovereignty, Calvinism, and Arminianism, the arguments around those positions, it's perhaps the most complicated theological position that has an impact on our day-to-day life, with eschatology being sort of behind that. The reason that I worded it like that is because I think your eschatological position is going to have less of an impact on your day-to-day life than the subject of God's sovereignty and what you believe about that. Although you could make the argument that eschatology is actually a more complicated field as a whole than discussions of sovereignty. And so, I mean, however you want to look at it, what we're going to be doing today is just trying to break it down and make it super simple, because I don't feel like going on for another 45 minutes about a subject that I haven't researched a whole lot of. And so my options were to do a ton of research in preparation for this video, or just tell you what I know, sort of where I land on the subject, and we'll move on from there. And so this is an area where I will not defend my position dogmatically. There are other areas of theology that I will stand on very firmly, that I will argue from the text, that I feel very strongly about. This is not one of them. And as long as you remain cordial on this issue, as long as we can approach it with love and grace, as we should with every complicated theological position, as long as that's your position, then I'm fine with that. So we are going to break this down. I should probably open up a new document here just to we're going to break this down in the three major branches of eschatology. It gets more complicated than this, but for our purposes, this is going to be complicated enough. So the first view is going to be premillennialism. The next view that we'll discuss is postmillennialism. I hate spelling these words too. And the last view is amillennialism. Within each of these views, particularly within premillennialism, things get super complicated. And really, I mean, if you want to watch Christians turn on each other and, I mean, just try to rip each other to pieces, take somebody who is a convinced dispensationalist premillennialist and somebody who is a convinced historical premillennialist and put them in a room together, and somebody's going to die. I mean, is the only logical outcome of that. This is where the argument gets really, really vicious, and that's why this is a subject that I just haven't found It's not something I'm super concerned about. So, yeah. All right. So, if we break up each of these words, you're going to notice a common thread, and that is the term millennium. Now, you might ask, why are we talking about the term millennium? What's this have to do with anything? So we'll open up our Bible program and we'll take a look at, I sure hope it's Revelation chapter 20. That's the number that's sticking in my head. If not, I'll have to do one of those fancy edits. No, don't update right now. Oops. I might have just hit the wrong button. There we go. Revelation 20, verse 7. So this is, in the middle of the book of Revelation, you have these scenes of great judgment. You have scenes of really God's power being fully displayed. And actually, well, yeah, we'll look at Revelation, I guess 27 is really what we'll be looking at. Oh, no, there it is. There it is. I knew that it was in Revelation 20. So we're looking at Revelation 20, verse 4. And then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him 1,000 years. And when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to deliver them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. And it goes on from there. There's obviously a lot happening here. Really, if you want to understand Revelation, you got to start from the beginning. It is not my intention to work my way through the entirety of Revelation because that is super complicated. And once again, this is a field that I have not spent a lot of time studying, so I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in this area of study at all. But what's important to see here is you have the issue of 1,000-year reign of Christ. So you have Jesus and his saints reigning for 1,000 years. And so when we talk about the millennial views, pre-mill, post-mill, and amill, you're looking at the issue of the 1,000-year reign of Christ. And this is really where the debate comes in. So we're going to start with premillennialism. This is the eschatological view that most people are familiar with. Oh man, I was really hoping that would be bigger. I just stole some images off of Google. Oh, it's gonna be blurry. As you can see, the premillennial timeline is pretty complicated. And so what the issue is and what the area of debate in eschatology is when do you believe that the millennium is? Is this a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ on the earth? When does this take place, or is it allegorical? Does it actually mean something else? And so the whole debate hinges on the millennium. So the premillennial view is that you have the church age, you have rapture, Christ descends, there's 7 years of tribulation, there's the reign of the Antichrist, Old Testament saints, New Testament tribulation saints, so those that have survived during the time of the tribulation are raised. There is a huge battle, the Battle of Armageddon, and then there is the millennial kingdom where Jesus, after the rapture, after the tribulation, after all these big events, Jesus is king over the earth. It's only him and believers here on the earth. And then you have, and so that's 1,000-year reign of Christ. And so Satan has been thrown into the abyss, into the pit, as Revelation says, and then it says at some point he will be released. So Satan is loosed at the end of the millennial kingdom, and then there is one great final judgment, the judgment of the wicked, and then we get to the eternal state where this cataclysm finally comes to an end, and that's that. And that is an overly simplistic view. Anybody who is a hardcore premillennialist is upset at me right now for not going into great detail on all of these points. And so be it. This graph, if I am understanding things correctly, is the historic premillennial position. The other view would be dispensational premillennialism, which focuses heavily on the relationship of the nation state of Israel as being God's elect people, separate and distinct from his elect people in the New Testament, and that is the New Testament church. So you have Israel and the church, and they each play a vital role in the overall scheme of things. And if I'm remembering correctly, dispensationalist premillennialism has the nation of Israel coming to faith and believing in Jesus, and that is part of the end times. And so people that are premillennial are very often the ones that are pointing to events happening in the world and saying, this is a sign of the end times. So you have when Israel became a nation again in, I believe, the 1950s, right after World War II, many people looked at that and said, this is prophesied. Israel has to be a nation for the end to come. Therefore, this is a fulfillment of prophecy. When the barcode was first invented, that we... The barcode that we put on our books and all sorts of things, when that was first invented, many Christians said, it's the mark of the beast, and you shouldn't do this, or you'll be bound by the Antichrist. And so the people that, to some extent, go crazy when talking about the end times, that is largely premillennialists. That's not to say that there aren't crazy people in the other two camps. It's just that when you hear people... or you hear of people walking around with big signs that say the end is nigh, these people that are like, we could be raptured at any second now. That is the mentality of the premillennialist eschatological viewpoint. So I don't have a problem with anybody being premillennial. I will say, though, that the danger of this position is that you begin looking at the world and saying, oh, it's going to hell in a handbasket. And really, premillennialism is a pessimistic view of history. It is that the world is just going downhill. The vast majority of people are going to hell, and then you have this little remnant of a church that survives, and then Christ comes, and that's that. So there are people that are, because of their premillennial convictions, not everyone who's a premillennialist thinks like this, but there are people that because of their premillennialist convictions say, hey, I could be raptured at any second. None of this really matters. I don't need to be going out there and proclaiming the gospel. It's just my job as a Christian to be a good Christian and kind of hide out in my little bunker and just wait for the end to come. That is not a Christian position to take on things. It completely goes against, say, the Great Commission of Jesus to go and disciple all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That kind of a mindset is not healthy nor productive for the church. So that's premillennialism. Let's take a look at post. I nearly forgot to explain one more thing. I said that the whole debate is based around the millennium. So you have the millennium here in big, bold. Premillennialism is going to be of the position that Christ's return is before the millennium. So pre-millennial return of Christ. So before the millennium, Jesus returns. And so in the premillennial view, he returns and then he rules and reigns for 1,000 years on the earth. And that's that. And everything else that we just went through. Postmillennialism is the view that Jesus returns after a not literal 1,000-year reign. So the way that postmillennials and amillennials as well view the 1,000 years in the book of Revelation is as allegory instead of literal years. So what that means is that these positions recognize that there are times in the Bible when numbers are used not as a literal figure, but as a representation of a fullness or completion. So you have the You have Jesus when he's teaching, and I believe it's Peter says to him, hey, if my brother sins against me and then comes and asks for forgiveness, should I forgive him? And Jesus says yes. And Peter says, if he comes to me 7 times and asks for forgiveness, should I forgive him 7 times? And Jesus says, you shall forgive him 70 times 7 times. Jesus is not laying down a literal number there to talk about how many times you should forgive somebody that sins against you and then comes and asks for forgiveness. Jesus is using that multiplication, using that greater number to represent a sense of you should just be a forgiving person. It is a sense of fullness and completion. And so you have in the post-mill and amill views this idea that the 1,000 years in the book of Revelation is not a literal 1,000 years, but it is a number used to represent completion. Much in the same way, they would argue that the 140,000, or is it 144,000, spoken of in the book of Revelation as being those that will be of the tribes of Israel going into the kingdom. They would look and say that's not a literal number. It's not a literal 144,000. It's numbers of completion showing that God has accomplished all of his purposes for the nation of Israel. So the post-mill view is that you have the cross. You have the death, burial, resurrection of Christ. That starts the present age, which is the church age. And so you have the gospel going out into all of the world, and post-millennial teachers will very often quote the verse that is more quoted than any other verse of the Old Testament by the New Testament, and that is, it's from Psalm 110, sit at my right hand and I will make your enemies a footstool for your feet. So this is the Father speaking to Jesus saying, I will make your enemies your footstool. So post-mills will say that the death, burial, resurrection of Christ has happened, and so the church began at that point, and the gospel goes out into all of the nations. And it's truly a fulfillment of the Great Commission. It's a fulfillment of Jesus' enemies being made a footstool for his feet. So more and more people will be converted. The gospel and Christianity will have a greater and greater influence on the world. And then at some point, that ushers in what would be known as the golden age. That ushers in the millennium. And so the sense is that Jesus is ruling and reigning now. He has ascended to high. He is at the right hand of the Father, and he is ruling and reigning. And as that mustard seed that he spoke about, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. It starts out small and it grows and gets big. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven in a lump, and slowly when you work it through, it leavens the whole lump of dough. So the kingdom is growing within the world today. And Jesus is slowly bringing his enemies under his submission. And then at the end, after the gospel has gone out into all of the world, and the gospel, I mean, truly in history wins, that's when the eternal state is ushered in. So that's when you have the actual final judgment, resurrection, new heaven, new earth, spoken of in the book of Revelation. So that is the post-mill view. And then you have the amillennial view. Pre means before, so before the millennium is the return of Jesus. Post-millennialism teaches that Jesus returns after the non-literal 1,000 years. So after the gospel has gone out into history, Jesus returns. Amillennialism teaches that there isn't a literal millennium, just like the post-mill position does. It teaches that at the cross, Satan was bound. So the binding of Satan mentioned in the book of Revelation was accomplished at the cross. And so the church expands in history, and then Satan is loosed and we experience a decline. You experience the tribulation. You experience then the return of Christ. So after the gospel goes out and then Satan is loosed once again, the world falls back under his submission. There's the great tribulation. There's all of these things that take place. And then Christ returns, there's the resurrection, and then there's the eternal state, new heaven, new earth. So it's something similar of post-millennialism, except it's more pessimistic. So where Premillennialism is the world is going to hell in a handbasket. Postmillennialism is the gospel wins in history. Ultimately, there will be more people saved than people lost. You're going to have a golden age where everybody knows about Jesus and everybody believes in him, worships him, and follows him. And that's that golden age of him ruling and reigning. Now, amillennialism basically looks and says that the kingdom of God is not a literal kingdom here on the earth like what postmillennialism would teach. Post-mill theology would teach that Jesus is establishing his kingdom here physically on the earth now as we speak, and it's our job to go forth. Amillennialism says the kingdom is a spiritual spiritual condition in the heart of believers, and so that's what we experience in the timeline. So amillennialism does tend to be a little bit more pessimistic in the sense that there is still going to be that decline before the tribulation and all of those things. There are people that call themselves optimistic amillennialists, and I guess the only difference is they don't believe in a literal rule and reign of Christ here on the earth. They only believe in a spiritual, in your heart rule and reign of Christ on the earth, but they still believe that the world is going to be getting better. Like I don't completely understand how it's different than postmillennialism. I feel like there was one thing. Oh, the other thing that's worth pointing out with postmillennialism, we'll go back to that here real quick. Postmillennialism would teach that there was the crucifixion, and then in the year 70 AD, so very shortly after the crucifixion, the year 70 AD was when the temple fell as Jesus prophesied in Matthew 23. It's when these, I mean, in a sense, these tribulations happened, or I guess the post-millennial view would be that the tribulation mentioned in the book of Revelation was actually what John was writing about, something that had already taken place. So the tribulation had already taken place. It was the persecution that the church faced in the year 70 AD when the Romans came in and just overthrew Jerusalem. So in the post-mill view, John was writing about the literal events that he had experienced. So that's different, obviously, than the Great Tribulation that takes place in at least premillennialism and in some cases amillennialism. Now, keep in mind there are nuances to all of these positions. I gave just a brief overview of things. We could look at different charts. I downloaded this one, but it's going to end up being really blurry. So there you have, and so this is like historic premillennialism. You have church age, you have the 7 years of tribulation, the rapture takes place, and then after that, Jesus returned. Well, yeah, so I guess that is a post-tribulation rapture. There are some premillennialists that believe in a pre-tribulation rapture, which is like right here. And then I've heard also of mid-tribulation rapture. So premillennialist view, within the premillennialist view, there's a lot more argumentation, I feel, than something like the postmillennial view, where anybody who's post-mill, there's debates of what the kingdom of God on the earth looks like. That's where you get the debate of should theonomy be a thing? Should we be using the law in Deuteronomy as our civil law today? So, should capital punishment be reinstated for cases of adultery, for example? That would be the discussion of theonomy versus a non-theonomic post-millennial view. So there's all sorts of nuances that go into this. And that is ultimately why I come down on this and basically say, hey, here's the overview. I understand where people are at on this. I am not committed, really. If I had to pick a position, I am somewhere between amillennial and postmillennial. I understand and I believe that God is the one controlling history, so I understand the post-millennial idea of Jesus is ruling and reigning. There are numerous examples in the Bible of nations rise and fall based on the will of God. He's the one that's in control of all of these things. It's just like Acts chapter 17 that we just read on Wednesday night, where Paul says very clearly to the Greeks, like, God is the one that's in control. So I'm sympathetic to that side of postmillennialism. I guess I question if the world's really getting better or not. Maybe I'm just too narrow-minded about it. It's just something that I haven't taken the time to really thoroughly research. So I'm somewhere around amillennial or postmillennial. All of the dating and the theories and everything surrounding premillennialism, I'm not convinced that that millennium mentioned in Revelation is a literal 1,000 years. I would fall more on the side, obviously, of it being a non-literal 1,000-year reign of Christ, more representing the fullness of his reign and things like that. So I don't know. That's that. There you go, guys. If you want the one subject that I am not prepared to talk super in depth about, this is the one. I can discuss all sorts of weird things, but my view of the end times is something that I haven't really taken that much time to put into it. Let me finish on this point though. And let me say why this hasn't been a big deal to me. I've become more and more convinced that our obligation as Christians here on this earth is to be living godly lives, to be proclaiming the gospel, to see God magnified in our own personal lives. So even if premillennialism is correct, and even if I could be raptured up right now, I am still going to be living my life in a way that is getting out there, engaging with the culture around us, proclaiming the gospel. I want to be a light in a dark world. That's where I fall on this. So the way that I view it, as long as you are motivated to be salt and light in the world, I don't care what your view of the millennium is. It really does not mean anything to me. As long as you believe what Jesus taught, that we're to have an active influence on the world. If you believe the post-millennial view that you are supposed to be establishing God's kingdom here on the earth, that God is using us as his vessels to bring about his millennial reign, okay, great. If you believe the millennial reign is simply a spiritual condition in the heart, okay, fine. I don't know. I'm not convinced either way. I just know my obligation, and I truly believe it's an obligation as a Christian, is to be salt and light in the world. And so as long as your view of the end times does not conflict with you being salt and light, I'm fine with it. So there you go. That's that. I hope this has been helpful. Sorry I don't know more about it. But the other reality is I've planned 3 lessons this week. I don't have time to sit down for another couple of hours and study this. So there you go, guys. I hope this has been helpful. I'll see you Wednesday.